Welcome to the show where you don't know if it's part of the show. Welcome to the show. If you don't know, it's part of the show. Didn't they teach you to reach for the stars while opening up the bars and keeping you chained down with mortgage bills and cars? Vaccines for your arms, kids sounding like supercharged, caffeinated hate-filled scars and rage-quit repertoires. No answers for yards, caught up in emotion that's not even yours. Imposter truths like impeccable retards, lined up for your serving of gish galloping wars. No remedy can't save the lost, in love with the yarn. I'm tired of walking into refracted shards, poor science displayed by disgusting bards. Soaked in sin with your dupe is delight in a new hand of cards. Been so long, seems like for love I'm just too hard, that's it. Welcome to the show where you don't know if it's part of the show. Welcome to the show. If you don't know, you don't know. Intoxicated 8 makes you believe you're spinning in space while you have no shame or grace. It's a disdainful state I used to contemplate, how to save myself from my own self-hate. Wonder why I was even made with a dreadful fate, forced to try and awake with a full plate, no one to help me stay awake or educate. I've had to liberate and fight through hidden gates, but my brother, heaven could never be late, and rockets don't work in space. It's all fake, the show is on Mars, it's a joke, but you're too far gone, it won't be long. Pepe's beak is strong.
This is Red Hen Radio. I'm Mark, the better looking one.
He's kidding, folks.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Doxey, one of the contributing hosts of Red Hen Radio. The purpose of this channel is to investigate the truth, be it political, educational, historical, medical or theoretical. Both the topic and guests are not necessarily endorsed by Red Hen Radio. The hosts of this podcast will present information as evenly as possible, allowing the topic to be understood, and all guests will be taken at face value. Thank you for listening, and all we ask is that you like, subscribe, comment and share.
Welcome back to another exciting adventure of Red Hen Radio. I'm your host, Travis Finlay. This is part 2 of my interview with Crrow777. Not going to really beat around the bush with anything. If you listen to the first one, you know what's going on, so sit back and enjoy the ride.
Let me throw something at you. For instance, talking about the image of God. My perspective on Genesis chapter 1 is proleptic. That is, that it's not that God created man in his image in the beginning, but rather that's the result at the end. So the story of Genesis 1 is anticipatory. It is proleptic. It's talking about what's going to happen in the future because of the incarnation. That is, that the Bible's presentation that God becomes man, right? The divine takes on the human. Okay, that has to have an alchemical purpose. Those two combinations has to be for a particular reason. So my take on it as I process all of it is the reason why God had to become man was because that was the only reason for man to become divine. So the image of God is the result of the incarnation. It couldn't happen before then. It couldn't happen prior to that.
Well, from my point of view, any scripture in this world that's been around for a long time has many, many, many levels of meaning. And in the West, unfortunately, those guys in the black that stand up in the front on the podium, most of them have lost sight of what's actually on offer there, 7 levels deep or more. But, you know, this is the problem with literal thinking. It's materialistic. It's hyper-materialism to be so literal in all our thinking. And there was a time, apparently, in this world when philosophy was the highest endeavor of a man. And that's not literal in the same way alchemy, to achieve the heights in alchemy that are claimed. These are not literal processes, but I guess I would take one literal line from the Bible, and you're instructed flat out, if you want to find the kingdom of God, seek within. What more do you need to be told there, really?
Can you tell us where you are in your examination of your Russian research? Does that give you enough of a indication of where I want you to go?
Yeah, and I'll be blunt with the answer. I walked away from it. I assume you're talking about the Hadibov. We walked away from it. When I first started getting translations, it felt like we might be looking at the only description of a lunar wave that I'd ever run into. And as we got into it, pretty soon it was spiders, alien spiders made this world. And it was like all these followers creating a church of spiders or something. This became very unhelpful. So I went to brass tacks and said one simple thing: can we prove Hadibov was a real man? We couldn't do it. It was all obscured in fame and hearsay. And at that point, I walked away from Hadibov all the way and never went back and will not go back. Initially, it seemed like, as we were getting basically views of what went on in a Russian-speaking chat room, that they were talking about the lunar wave, which pointed to a man named Hadibov, supposed man named Hadibov, okay, who very well, after I think 6, 7, 8, 9 translations, I forget how many, of the translators, more than half of them thought it was a description of the lunar wave. As we started to go through the vast amounts of things assigned to Hadibov, who was supposedly a polymath, we got into spider aliens who brought all life here in thermoses and all this other stuff that common sense will not allow me to accept. That's when I challenged to try to prove he was a real living man, and we couldn't really do it. And at that point, I walked away. But that sets aside the main reason is I don't think it's helpful for alien spiders from Mars to be part of a common sense narrative, because there is no foundation. It's just all hearsay. Just because someone says a thing doesn't make a thing worth talking about.
All right, you've talked about the moon not being a rock orbiting our planet, but that it is a part of the control system in which we live. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think since those older clips, I have a much better precise view, but people probably won't like the answer because everyone wants a really literal response from me. Here's what I'll tell you. When you look up at night, everything you see, or in the day for that matter, is a luminary. People are going to want more than that, but I'm sorry. That's what they are to me. They're luminaries, and they're all here as part of this system. They're not a million light years away or some other nonsensical scientific construct. They're here as part of this 3D material cycle of hardship that we're all going through. It is a clock. Everything up there is a clock, and it defines the aspects of nature. And that too has been literally deconstructed to warp minds, you know, the idea that Jupiter was a god. I don't believe that back in the day anyone thought of Jupiter as a god. Maybe they used the word in a different way. I think it was understood that it was an aspect of nature. All these things are aspects of nature, so that's currently how I reference it. And to put a fine point on it, no, the moon is not a rock in so-called space.
All right, so when you say control system, though, you're just simply, I guess you would just simply mean nature. It's just, when we talk about the moon, when we talk about the luminaries, we're simply talking about the world that we observe. Is that what you mean by control system, or is there something?
Right. To take that a little further, it's a bit like an alchemical process, how I view it now. We've never been out of our atmosphere in so-called space. Everything you've ever seen, every image is a construct. It's a lie from my point of view. We live in a closed system, and that's a bit like an alchemical procedure. In other words, every element that's ever going to be here in this world is here now. Nothing's going to be added, nothing's going to be subtracted. And in this near perfect system, from our point of view, things will just cycle. One thing will transmute into the next, into the next, into the next, in an ever endless cycle of change.
If there is no lie in nature, what does the lunar wave reveal?
Boy, that's the $64,000 question. I have assumptions that I've made, but they're just best guesses. Maybe it's part of the hard, fast boundary, which maybe the Bible would call the firmament, and other traditions describe this very same thing. Maybe it has to do with space as possibly a liquid, or what we call space as some kind of liquid. These are hard things to know because, unfortunately, many of us are basically like ants, right? We look up, we don't have a way to go confirm all these things, and the powers that be that do have the ability to go that high aren't telling us the truth. In short, I wish I could tell you certainly what the lunar wave is, but I can tell you certainly that there's no way in heck I was the first guy to ever know about it, yet I seem to be the first guy who ever brought it to public attention.
Yeah. So I shot some footage the other night, and I got a nice shot of Venus. It's about a minute long, and I put it up on my channel. But I got some great liquid footage that shows you. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. You've seen it.
On a defocus, you mean?
On with my Nikon P900.
Okay.
So I just ran, whenever I have an opportunity to shoot, I'll go through all of my settings and take images from each setting to just see which ones are different and if they catch anything different. So I chose the best one that I thought showed the way that the star or the way that Venus appears to be viewed through liquid, right? I mean, because it shimmers, it dances, it waves. Is that answering your question?
Well, I would just add, Venus is one of the brightest things we can look at outside of like the full moon, basically. People are often stunned when they see Venus because it's like a very brilliant, bright, piercing diamond. But one trick you can use when you're filming it is just defocus a bit. And so when you've defocused, you'll get the identical pattern of maybe a pool with the light in it at night when the water's been disturbed. That will be the pattern that is revealed to you if you overfocus or underfocus something like Venus, any given thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That was my footage. Was more like that, looking through a pool. Yeah.
Right. Right, that's one of the wonderful things about optical tools is they can give us a view that we can't have with just our naked eyes,
right,
because we can't really defocus our eyes. But you know, Venus is an odd duck too, of the so-called planets, which again I state are just luminaries. It's the only one that phases like the moon, so it's peculiar in that regard too.
Yeah, well, you know, I came across a channel last week that made the suggestion that Venus and Mars are the sun and moon of another dimension that we can't get to. So
hard things to know.
Yeah, no, sure, but it was interesting because again, it does look like Venus has the same. So if Venus is the moon for an extended plane on a different puddle that has other land masses in it, and Mars is the sun, that it was just really interesting to think about it that way.
Right. I mean, these are interesting ideas. I just don't know how you get a basis. Do we have some older culture who's provided the basis, or are these fresh observations? They're interesting ideas, but I don't know how. You know, it's a bit like the lunar wave. Everyone always asks me, what is it? And I always have to say, I really wish I knew, but what I know is it was hidden, because there's no way in heck I'm the first guy who ever saw it.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's impressed me. So again, with my Christian upbringing, you know, astrology and astronomy and what they would classify as worshiping the stars, so to speak. If you you have that indoctrination that clouds your view, but when you talk about it in a way that's natural, it makes so much sense to me that if we talk about the sun, the moon, and the zodiac as being clocks, that makes so much sense to consider it that way, as opposed to the Gregorian calendar that we've got that doesn't operate along that construct.
Well, you know, it goes to show you the power of programming language. You know, even in the biblical sense, you're being told, all are of the dust and all shall return to the dust. So what's being stated there? Guess what? You live in a natural world. You're going to be made up of part of the natural world. And when you die, you're going to dissolve back into it. But by the way, don't show that natural world one iota of respect. That's programming. And that's why I make such a point of pointing out that everything you can see is part of what we call the natural world, and that it can help get you back to a common sense basis. When you see a bird or a tree do a thing, there's no beguilement, there's no lie there. That is an honest representation of some aspect of this reality.
Yeah. I've got a friend who wants me to ask you about the sun and the equinox. So he says, is the sun where it is supposed to be during the equinox? Does that question make sense to you?
So if I had to guess, what he's asking is maybe is the mainstream account of where the sun should be actually where it is? And the answer to that would be no, because in the everything spinning mainstream model, the sun would be coming to 0 degrees declination lined up with the equator. That's provably not true. Every year when you hear from the media, guess what? Today's the equinox, they're lying to you. And the reason that this can be proven is because for an equinox to occur, it's dependent on where the observer is observing. It's no different than a sunrise or a sunset. A guy in New York does not witness sunrise and sunset at the same time as a guy in Hollywood, California. It just doesn't. The equinox is no different. But what we went on to show was not only did the equinox not resemble the historical accounts we were handed through the mainstreams, it's wholly dependent on the observer. So one day in the northern part of the United States, from east to west, there will be a day where most people get equal day and night, which we accept is the idea of an equinox because that's what it means, equal night. But if you're a little further south, it'll probably be a day later, a little further south, but there's much more to it than that. You get down around the equator, we found all kinds of anomalies where one place appears to have an equal day and night, and then a place not too far away appears not to. These are tough things, but we were using the Naval Observatory as one of the main timekeeping places to look up set and rise times, and then they locked the site. They booted everyone in my forum out for a period of days. So again, I guess it's a big secret to understand when the sun is rising and setting.
To me, you could only know about the equinox after the event, because you wouldn't know that you had an equal amount of day and night until after the event. You can't necessarily predict it, right?
Well, let me refine that idea. Any person who actually went out and observed the length of a day could deduce the length of a night or these kinds of ideas. But there's also tools, and you'll have to decide how accurate they are, that will let you know. You can look it up in advance when that equal day and night is. And we're not talking like within a couple minutes. We're talking to the second, equal day and equal night. And in the forum on Crrow777 Radio, there's an equinox thread, which is massive. There's another zodiacal thread going on right now, where everything we learned was written down. And again, it really appears that this is something they don't want you looking at, because we had numbers of people going into the time and date from the Naval Observatory, who supposedly has the cesium clock and all this other nonsense, who, by the way, is still tracking the Julian calendar for some reason. They shut it down when a flood of people from Crrow777 Radio started looking up rise and set times of the moon and the sun and these things. And not only that, it got to the point where we began to understand the Golden Gate Bridge as an example. Its orientation and its name encodes an older idea for the spring equinox. It used to be called the Golden Gate. The fall equinox was the Silver Gate. But this is still key and still a big mystery, because we're challenging the zodiac now and the idea of Libra. But that is a massive conversation. I will suffice it to say that I do not accept Libra as a zodiacal sign per se. It's more like an aspect of the idea of the equinox that happens around that time of year.
What was it for you that elicited within you a desire to look for your very first there?
Does
that make sense?
I think, yeah, I didn't do well in school as a child because I didn't accept what was going on. I actually loathed it. And it got to be where my life as a younger person became almost wholly about, how do I get out of this? I don't want to appreciate the school I'm being forced into. How do I get out of it? I actually left school before I graduated high school the first time. I've gone back to school many times since. But for a portion of my early life, it's almost like all my energies became about, how do I get away from these things I'm being forced into and do my own thing? I guess the short answer is I just didn't accept all the things I was being handed. So I don't know at what point it actually happened, but I had a hard time accepting or doing what I was told from the get-go, just about.
Yeah, I think back to my own transformation as well, and I think that for me, if I hadn't changed my views theologically, I don't think that the the information that I received a year ago about the scientific reality of the heliocentric model versus the geocentric model. And if I hadn't been transformed in the way that I thought about the Bible, I don't think that I would have been ready to accept the information about reconsidering the nature of our world. So you brought up, the comment, men in black coats, and that was my, my challenge was, okay, what you're telling me doesn't match up with the way I read the text, which is the similar analysis of saying to a scientist, what you're telling me doesn't match up with the way I see the world. The way I see the world doesn't match up with your scientific model. And I had to make a decision. I had to decide, because I had everybody, including my own family, telling me, don't go down this road. Don't turn away from this tradition. Yeah, it was very interesting.
Well, you see, that's a funny thing. People can easily be programmed by simply being told the same thing over and over and over. So I will ask you, way back in the day before Protestantism or suppose these things, Vatican was basically the holder of the Christian tradition, or the so-called, whatever people want to call it. They understand what I'm getting at here. Those priests, those men were telling you, you have no access to God. That's why our Catholic priests are here, because that's the only access to God you can get. Yet in the very book they were holding, had people been able to read it, which is part of the reason Latin was brought to bear, because so few could speak it, it was telling you, if you want to find the kingdom of God, look within yourself. So it's not even necessarily about casting aside a tradition. It's just that people are so programmed, they get afraid that if they don't do exactly what they're told, they're going to go burn in hellfire. Well, I got news. That book just told you that you were created in the image of God, and to find the kingdom of God, you look within. Well, I don't need a priest or an intercessor or anything else in this world to look within myself. And the very book people are accusing you of walking away from has given you all the instruction you will ever need. And in a way, this is degrees of interpretation. At what point do you read the words for yourself and quit listening to the guy in the black in the front of that room, supposedly telling you all his learned tradition, which for the most part is just a literal reading of words that have many levels of meaning, to incorporate the alchemical natural world ideas all within those scriptures, I would add.
Yeah, I'm wrestling with whether or not to challenge your perspective on the kingdom of God being within. Part of it is, again, my training. Part of it is my process, because I would say that the basic understanding of Jesus's words is that his presence in their midst is the representation of the kingdom of God. So basically, he's basically saying, I'm bringing the kingdom to you. It's among you. And again, we don't have to really go down this rabbit hole to discuss Greek, but the ambiguity of the preposition among or within or around or about is, in my mind, a little bit flexible. So I understand what you're saying. I understand it, and I'm not.
Well, even these things bring problems, because you're told that the first scripture came to us in Greek, and yet the Vatican conveniently lost the original. But guess what? They have this exact copy somehow. In my view, the original was brought to you in Latin, but we have shown beyond doubt, from my estimation, that each of the 12 major Catholic saints that are ported up are representing the Son in one of the acceptable months in the acceptable year of the Lord. We've shown these things. And so it opens up a whole new way of viewing. But, this is the problem with religion. When you talk about it, people are easily upset. And so that's why I opt most of the time to let people make up their own minds with regard to religion, and just try to point out that there's a whole natural world here. And regardless of your religion, supposedly a creator put it here. So what does that tell us about the natural world?
For the listener who's hearing some of this for the very first time, the person who has yet to squint at what he's been told in terms of looking at it, out of the side of his eye, you know what I mean? For the person who's hearing our discussion for the first time and he's never considered questioning his reality, what would you say to him to begin that process?
Well, let's use the natural world. There's not a thing that exists that if you took time to examine it, anything, your favorite animal, anything in this world, if you took time to study it and examine it, firsthand observation, I would guarantee you that you will walk away with a whole different understanding and perception of that thing, whatever it is. And that's the problem with the mainstream narrative in our world. It comes to us mostly from big corporations, and they have an agenda. And by the way, the biggest corporations in the world are owned by precious few ancient families, and they're doing all this for a reason, from the evening news to the movies and TV shows you watch. They're all full of agenda. So if you take the time to cast that aside temporarily and go out with your own eyes and observe carefully certain things, each time you do that, it will expand your understanding of that given thing.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. And to just go back, it's paying attention and using common sense. It's using logic. It's using your empirical experience. It's the ability to hear and to see and to taste and to touch and to process that information rather than simply being what is called a sheeple, for lack of a better term, just someone who doesn't question, who just goes along to get along, doesn't ask questions, keeps his head down. Your explanation, I understand it, to a certain extent, you're basically saying, look, just go outside and just start to pay attention.
Well, I guess some people might actually put it like this: go out and use your God-given abilities as a human being, right?
Yeah.
Because for the most part, when you're told a thing, if you just decide to believe in it, then you are just regurgitating what you've been told, have never taken the time to apply your God-given abilities to understand whether it's correct or not. And so much of our school, from my point of view, it's not learning, it's memorization and regurgitation. That's mostly what most of school has become. And I would urge people to use their human given abilities and bring them to bear. Observe, challenge, and examine. And each time you do that, the amount of understanding you have in your life will expand.
If you were given the opportunity to visit a classroom, if you were given the opportunity to have that open forum to say whatever you want to 13-year-olds, okay, you have an opportunity. You can say whatever you want. What would you say to them? They are looking at you. There's nothing but silence. You're looking at them, and the very first words out of your mouth, what would they be?
Well, that's tough. Maybe something like, each of you is a human being, which is probably the highest life form in this current world. And if you go out and challenge everything you're told and examine everything you want to know about, that's the best a human being can do. These are touchy subjects because I am not responsible for educating people's children, and people will become upset if you say certain things to their children. So I mean, it's like a double-edged sword, that question, what I would like to say and what I would actually say. Let's face it, when a child is a child, they're under the dominion of their parents. And so my initial responsibility is probably to the parents of that child.
Okay, right. So that, let me say then, I was presupposing that you had signed permission slips from all of these children. The parents said, my child has permission to sit in this classroom. We know who Crow is. We know what he's about. So this signature is carte blanche for you to say what you want. That's the idea behind it. That you were given the opportunity to be in a classroom where you have that prerogative. So change it to a classroom of adults if you want. My point still remains. That is, what would be the first thing that you would say? And you've already said it to a certain extent.
I guess if that was the case and it was carte blanche, I would try to instill that almost everything you know about this place we call the world has been intentionally misdescribed. And as a human being, you have the power to go out and observe and correct the lies that you've been told. I would tell them that space is nothing like what you've been told. I would tell them that nothing has left this world. There's a hard, fast barrier above our head. No one has been to what we call outer space. And in knowing that, it even informs you that you don't understand where you exist right now. And if you don't understand where you exist, you have little chance of understanding where you can go from there. And I would try to instill that a human being has the given or God-given ability to bring the powers of observation and challenging to try to get to some modicum of reality.
All right, so imagine someone in the classroom then raises their hand to ask you a question, and they would say, can you tell me a little bit, what did you mean by a hard and fast barrier?
That we seem to live in a closed system, and that there is not man or machine that can pierce that barrier. And so we basically all live here in the world under the illusion that we have been outside of this world. We live here. This is where we are, and apparently no one has ever left here with their body.
So again, I guess the child would say, how could you justify a hard and fast barrier? How do you, Crow, have you been up there? Have you witnessed this thing firsthand?
No, but I've challenged everything that's been offered me to show me that people have been on the other side of that barrier, and I've demonstrated that it's all a lie or a construct.
So again, why do you choose to use the word hard and fast? I mean, again, I think I understand what you're saying to a certain extent, but I don't want to put words into your mouth, and I don't want to misrepresent you.
Because I don't want to reiterate scientific terms, and I don't want to reiterate religious terms, but I want to convey an idea. The idea here is that there's some sort of almost like a wall that prevents us from going, but I don't want to use the religious idea of a firmament and all the baggage that brings, and I don't want to bring the scientific ideas which are actively engaged in lying. If people ask me, actually, what is the hard, fast barrier? My best guess is that it's superheated plasma. The moon is likely electric, or the sun is likely electric, the moon likely magnetic. Maybe that hard, fast barrier is superheated plasma of some sort. And that would be ironic, right? How many times have you seen the Hollywood movie where the spaceship's burning back into the atmosphere? You can see the irony in that if any of what I said or supposed has any correctness.
Okay. So I guess the way that I'm going to approach this is from my experience with Nathan Oakley's channel on the Flat Earth debate. And that is that one of the housekeeping questions that he goes through at the beginning of each of his shows, he asks the question of the panel that's there, is there any evidence of a pressurized system next to a non-pressurized system without a barrier? So that, in my mind, is the approach of that empirically. That is that we can't have a pressurized system without a barrier because of what we understand about entropy.
Right, I would agree with that statement.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so that's a little bit of where I would go if I'm thinking about it, based on the question that I asked you, based on what we know about our atmosphere and the pressure gradient or the density gradient of however you want to describe it, that it requires it. The prerequisite to having pressure is a container.
Right. I think it's one-to-one, verbatim, like the alchemical procedures have tried to show us, that we're in basically a sealed flask, if we were to use that as the analogy, and that everything we have has always been here. And the idea of transmutation, not in the chemist's sense of transmutation, but in the alchemical sense, the philosophical sense of transmutation, everything here is so well designed that it one thing into another, into another, into another. One of the most basic forms of that idea is when water turns into vapor. It goes from liquid to gaseous, or air, water into air, and then it can come right back. You know, it'll rain, it'll become water again. But this happens with everything in our world. And I think the allegory of an alchemist's closed flask demonstrates the idea pretty concisely.
If you could just real quick go through your process of investigation when you have a certain topic. I mean, just...
Well, the first thing is common sense. You've got to train yourself back into the use of common sense. And when you first bump into a thing, bring common sense. Is this a common sense thing to accept? If it's not, then you already have the idea that maybe it's nonsense. If it is common sense, then you have a way to begin to challenge it. Just because a thing seems like it's common sense, it still needs challenging. The problem becomes is when I first began to do this, I realized everything I know is wrong. I have to throw it all out, everything. It's a bit like being in the middle of the ocean and letting go of your life preserver. It's not an easy thing to do. And over, you want to say, oh, to heck with this, I'm just going to grab the life preserver again. But don't do it. Throw it out. No longer is 1 + 1 2 until you examine it and confirm, yep, 1 + 1 is 2. Everything you have ever been shown, told, come to accept, all of it out the window, and you start clean. And each thing that comes to you, you verify, you challenge, you apply common sense. And in doing this, it won't be long before you understand that everything that comes from the news is nonsense. And so you understand that that source is there to provide programming and nonsense. So then you don't need to waste your time challenging it anymore. You understand it would be like a friend who lies all the time. If you have a friend that lies all the time, then you don't accept anything they say. You know better. The news is no different. And as you go through time and go through your life, you start to get a foundation that's worth standing on again.
What about resources? Things that what's that process? Do you look for written material, books, articles? Do you have particular websites that you trust that you go to?
No, I never. Online is my lowest form of validation. If I can find printed books, the older the better. That's where I like to start, with things that I say are before the modern edit. If you read a lot of books, you'll understand that sometime, before World War II-ish, it's kind of a blurry line. There started to be like a commonality to what I call the modern edit in information. That's my favorite source to start, but I try to verify everything in threes. And I would, even if I had a regular on-site line source, I would never state it. I try to be more random in the way that I collect information and not rely on any one thing. It's like each time you use a book for reference, next time around it will probably be a different book for reference, and I think that's a good thing. The online world of the internet is an unreliable thing. It's already gotten to the point where Jason and I have found just to do research using search engines like Google is nearly impossible. And for that matter, places like Google have been scanning every book in the world for years and years now. And you've got to understand that once a book is digitized, a push of a button could change the word murderer to mean interesting man. And if you don't understand that's the kind of thing that goes on in our world, then you've got some catching up to do.
Okay, so do you have anything in mind that you've seen that? I've heard you talk about that before, but
here's a perfect example. When I was still actively filming all the time in San Diego through my telescope, I did a clip. I don't remember the name of it, but I did the research at the time, how many satellites Google claimed there were. It was between 20 and 30,000 satellites, although it was unclear what the number was because they didn't understand how many dead or broken satellites there were. So let's just say they were saying roughly working 20,000 satellites. A few years later, I noticed the number was dropping. Today, if you go to Google and you look up how many active satellites are there, you'll get anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000. That's down from 20,000. And I'm here to tell you, there are no such thing, as satellites do not exist as they're described, because nothing leaves our atmosphere. There may be things in our atmosphere that are up there all the time, but that's not what you've been told a satellite is. You've been told a satellite is this thing that orbits in weightless vacuum of space, which I would ask, if there's so many thousands of these amazing things, how come an International Space Station person never put their iPhone out the window to show us one of these amazing things. There is no video footage or still of a supposed satellite doing what amazing satellites do in space. And I created a law, kind of like Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics. Here's Crow's law for common sense in the common era. If there is anything that exists in the common era that can be filmed in HD, it will be filmed in HD.
Right. Which then goes immediately into the construction of the ISS.
Right.
Nothing.
Exactly.
Nothing.
It's all a lie.
That's impossible.
It's all a provable lie.
That is absolutely, yeah. If you just sit back and think about that, if you just squint at that reality, you're going to say, how the hell did you guys not push record? What?
Well, there's more to it than that, because we've all been trained in school to think literally and regurgitate the things we've been told are true. But I would invite anyone listening, go online and look up a high altitude plane taking pictures of the world at about 70,000 feet. And you'll see that it's indistinguishable from what we've been told is being taken from outer space, which doesn't exist as you've been told it does.
Justify for us this statement. History is a lie agreed upon.
I can't justify it, but in making that statement, I have offered a very important concept. The only person that can justify whether that's correct or not is you. I've tried to provide evidences and other things, but everything that we cover on Crrow777 Radio is in the same boat as the idea of this question. I can tell you whatever I want to tell you. You shouldn't believe it. You shouldn't accept it. You should challenge it. And if you challenge it and find there's a there, then history is a lie agreed upon comes to mean wholly something different to each person out there. But I would assure you that, in fact, history is a lie agreed upon.
History is a lie agreed upon, and truth does not fear investigation.
That's right, and that should tell you something about the religion, the hyper-material religion that is modern science, that will tell you things like the Big Bang is real, when in fact the Big Bang violates the thermal laws, the laws of thermodynamics. It can be shown. And actually there are tons of physicists out there. They just don't get covered or have TV shows named after them. Yeah. So that's an important statement. Truth does not fear investigation. And as a matter of fact, well, go ahead, man.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, all these different parts of the world have all these sayings attributed to their religious traditions. The Buddha, the supposed Buddha, was attributed with having said 3 things cannot long be hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. I sincerely hope that there's accuracy to that statement, regardless of who said it.
Wow, man, I tell you what, this has been so good, and I want to thank you immensely for the time that you've given to me and then also our listeners when this is published. Is there anything that you're working on that we can look forward to?
Well, we've kind of been in a vein lately, Jason and I, kind of trying to marry what we call the natural world with a common sense approach to information. But I believe the next show will be 137. We may have one of our longtime followers on who has moved away from the cityfied condition and began to create a bit of a farm, getting back to nature, producing their own food. So I think that's what we'll cover. But you know us, we don't stay on the same topic for much time because it's all related in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. And then just briefly, how's the movie process for you guys?
So Jason, this is Jason's first edit, and he'll be producing the movie. I'm actually a very good video editor, but Jason's gonna do the initial edits. I don't know. I may end up doing some of the animation or transitions, but it should be shaping up. And it's just one of those things where the content is compelling. It's just how long will it take us to get it put together in a compelling way. We're really hoping that this will be released in the spring of 2019.
On the equinox?
Closest we can get.
That's awesome. Like what, May 20 or March 23rd, something like that, right?
I haven't actually gone to look it up, but here's the irony of equinoxes. Jason's in Baton Rouge, I'm up in Rhode Island, so almost certainly my equinox will not be his equinox.
so good. This is okay. Well, anyway, look, I hope that I can twist your arm sometime in the future, have you back on. I would love to have you as a return guest, Crow. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart. Seriously, your research and your presence has been an aspect of my transformation, and so I thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and I'm happy to come back. I'm glad to get invited to a place where someone is a good speaker and can keep it going and is familiar with the work I've done. And as all the followers who follow me know, I'm most interested in the grassroots movement. I'm not really that interested in the big famous places, so I'm happy to come back. All right, man. Cheers.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for being a part of my debut episodes with Crrow777. I hope that I did not disappoint. If you would be so kind as to subscribe and share these episodes so that the listening audience can grow, I would greatly appreciate it. And you didn't think I was going to forget about that little tidbit. You know, that one thing that I know that no one else knows about Crow?
Okay, something nobody knows about Crow. Let me see here. Oh, here's something. A while back, well, actually a long while back before I quit using Facebook, I got booted out a couple times, was forced to go through, and I quote, security checkpoints. And then at one point, they wouldn't allow me back in unless I presented them with an ID. I'm not even kidding. So what I did was I looked up the hardest names currently in our world, the hardest names that algorithms can data mine. And I found some of them to be American Indian names, so I took the last name, Triplehorn, appended it, made a fake ID, shipped it off to Facebook to regain entry. It was shortly thereafter that I quit using Facebook, and I won't use Facebook anymore. But there's something nobody knows about me, and by the way, it worked. Facebook fell for it hook, line, and sinker. And if my research was correct, a last name like Triplehorn is very hard to categorize or data mine, so there's that.